From Paris to Washington and seemingly everywhere in between, it's the same question. Is it time for governments to spend more or save? Seems there's no magic formula. Stimulus can produce growth. Austerity can produce growth. Cutting taxes can produce growth. Now, austerity happens when governments cut back on spending in order to get debt under control. But voters generally tend to dislike cuts because they get less. So governments typically don't impose on austerity, in many cases until it's almost too late. That was the case in Greece and to some extent in France. But people in both countries pushed back last weekend and voted out their pro-austerity leaders. On the other hand, stimulus is when the government pumps money into the economy in order to stimulate demand and aid business. The Obama administration used stimulus in 2009, as you know, but at the same time that the federal government ramped up spending, state and local governments cut back. So in effect, we tried stimulus and austerity at the same time. Ben Barber is a distinguished senior fellow at Demos. Will Kane is a CNN contributor. Let's all agree on something. The debate actually isn't austerity versus growth, which is how it's been painted in France. Those two things are not necessarily opposites. But let's talk about the best way to grow an economy, and that is where economists and Americans disagree. Take a look at this, guys. A recent poll from CBS News and the New York Times finds that 56% of Americans believe spending more and raising taxes will stimulate growth. 37% say we should lower taxes and cut spending instead. Those are opposites. Well, Governor Mitt Romney supports Paul Ryan, the budget chief's ideas in terms of cutting the budget. And they represent, in an American context, the austerity side of things to some degree. Has austerity ever created a job?
Well, yeah, man. What kind of question is that? Does North Korea have more jobs than South Korea? Who has a more vibrant economy? Let me ask you this. If Cuba privatized, fill in the blank, would it create jobs? I mean, when you ask me, does austerity ever create jobs? That's the logical endpoint of that kind of argument. But the real question is...
the logical endpoint of that argument is austerity should ultimately create jobs.
Yeah, and by extension, does the private sector create jobs? And I think at this point, we all clearly know the answer to that. The real answer to your question, though, is it depends, right? It depends on the scenario you find yourself in. If you find yourself in a scenario where you have high public debt and low private debt, as we did after World War II, well, then, yeah, austerity would make sense. The private sector would take off, and we did after World War II. But if you had the reverse, if you had high private debt, an indebted society, and low public debt, you'd have a hard time arguing for austerity. In Europe, you have a tough situation because you have both.
Yes.
And the bondholders are like, look, you may need to borrow to stimulate, but we don't trust you anymore.
Right.
In the United States, it's more complicated. We might have some room in the short term, but the long term seems pretty clear. We got to get our responsibilities.
So just to be clear, in Greece, the voters have said we don't want austerity, but the people upon whom they depend to lend the money have said we don't really care what you want. You're not getting the money if you don't do it. So Ben, help me out here, because in times when private enterprise doesn't do what Will has described, does it not fall to government to fix that?
Well, you haven't talked in Europe about the third partner in this negotiation, and that's the European Bank, that's the IMF, and that's Germany. The Greek leaders are not saying, screw what the Greek people think. They're saying, we're going to get screwed by the bank if we don't do the conditionality that they're asking for. So they don't like it. And in fact, what's happened with the socialists now is they're saying we're not going to do it anymore. Enough, because it's not working. And even Merkel is saying in Germany, I know we want to talk about the U.S., but it's very important because we're in a situation right now where America is trying to be more like Germany and Europe was for the last few years, and Europe is trying to be more like America is supposed to be. But the answer to your question, does government have a role? Of course it has a role. The federal government is the institution of last resort in times of crisis. If this isn't a crisis, the recession that we're in, the problems we're having, if it doesn't have a role in getting jobs moving with stimulus, with tax revenue increases if that's necessary, in cuts in the more fat parts of the budget, not the kids, and not food stamps, but then the federal government isn't doing its job. And you know what? 56% of the American people agree with me.
Will apparently doesn't.
No, I do not. It is not the federal government's role to create jobs. It is the federal government's role to create the conditions for job growth. And historically, we're very clear that the conditions for job growth are as low tax, low spending, clear, confident, low regulation environment as possible. That's the best conditions for growth in the private sector, which is the best engine for job growth that history has ever shown.
Will and I agree on that, but let's take Detroit. There's a perfect example of the difference between the parties, because Romney said, let's have a structured bankruptcy. Fine. And Obama said, yes, everybody agreed. We need that. Who pays for it? Romney said, let the market pay for it, and there was no money in the market. Bain Capital didn't put anything in. Nobody had money. The only people who could fund that structure was the taxpayers and the federal government, and that has now, first of all, the government's been repaid everything, so the taxpayers got back their money. Second of all, we now have a world in which American motor companies are very, very competitive, and in which 800,000 plus jobs were saved in Detroit. That's the feds intervening. I agree with Will, they didn't create those jobs, but they acted in ways that allowed those jobs to be recreated and save Detroit. That's exactly the kind of thing government does brilliantly.
All right, so the thing that most everybody agrees upon is that we want job creation. Whatever we do, we want job creation. In Europe, it's substantially worse than it is here, but it's bad here. I think the next biggest thing that people concern themselves in this debate between austerity and non-austerity are taxes. So when we come back, that's what we're going to talk about. Is it time to cut or raise taxes? And later, some rare insight into Mark Zuckerberg. We'll look at the man who remains an enigma.